In this episode, the goal is to make sure the key words you keep hearing in governance and security program work actually feel usable, not mysterious. A glossary sounds like something you would skim and forget, but for a beginner, the right definitions create a mental toolkit you can reuse across many situations. When you understand the terms in plain language, you can follow conversations, ask better questions, and avoid common misunderstandings that cause people to talk past each other. The important idea is that terms are not just vocabulary, they are compressed concepts, and if you do not unpack them, you can misjudge what a program is doing or why a decision was made. Each term here will be explained in a way that connects to what it means, why it matters, and how it shows up in real organizational behavior, without drifting into tools or configuration steps. As you listen, imagine these terms as labels for patterns you will recognize again and again, because that repetition is what makes them worth learning. By the end, you should feel like you can hear these terms in a meeting and immediately translate them into something concrete. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The word governance is often used as if it means a committee, but in plain language it means how an organization makes security decisions and ensures those decisions are followed consistently. Governance includes who has authority to approve policies, who accepts risk, who owns controls, and how progress is reviewed over time. It matters because without governance, security becomes a collection of individual efforts that may be good but are inconsistent and fragile. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking governance is only paperwork, when in reality it is the decision system that keeps security aligned with the mission. Governance shows up in things like clear roles, predictable approval paths, and regular reviews where leaders look at evidence and adjust priorities. When governance is strong, people know who decides and what happens next, which reduces both risk and confusion. When governance is weak, people guess, improvise, and route around obstacles, and that behavior creates exposure. Understanding governance helps you see that security is not just technical defense, it is organized decision-making. Risk is another term that people use casually, but it has a very specific meaning in security work. It is the possibility of harm, shaped by how likely an event is and how much damage it would cause. Risk matters because it is the reason security exists, and it is also the reason security must prioritize, since not every threat deserves the same attention. A beginner misunderstanding is assuming that risk means the same thing as threat, but a threat is a potential cause of harm, while risk is the combination of threat, weakness, and impact. In practice, risk shows up when leaders decide what controls to fund, which systems to protect first, and what trade-offs are acceptable. Risk also shows up in conversations about probability and consequence, such as whether an outage would be survivable or disastrous. When you think in risk terms, you stop chasing perfection and start reducing the harm that is most plausible and most costly. This mindset makes security decisions more rational and less reactive. A control is anything the organization uses to reduce risk, and controls can be preventive, detective, or corrective. Preventive controls try to stop bad outcomes from happening. Detective controls help you notice problems quickly, and corrective controls help you recover or fix issues after they occur. Controls matter because they are the practical mechanisms that turn policies and strategies into actual protection. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking a control is always a product, when controls can also be processes, training, reviews, and clear ownership. In practice, controls show up as steps people take, checks systems perform, and routines teams follow, like verifying access, reviewing changes, monitoring important activity, or testing recovery. Controls work best when they are designed to be repeatable and sustainable, because inconsistent controls create gaps that attackers and accidents can exploit. Understanding controls helps you evaluate whether a program is truly reducing risk or only producing documents. When someone says a control is in place, a good beginner question is whether it works reliably under real-world pressure. Policy is a term that can feel intimidating, but in plain language, a policy is a written rule or statement of expectation that guides behavior across the organization. Policies matter because they make decisions consistent, and they clarify what is required and what is prohibited, especially in situations where people might otherwise guess. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking policy equals procedure, when policy states what must be true, and procedures describe how you do it. In practice, policies show up as documents that define things like data handling rules, access expectations, or incident reporting requirements. Policies must be understandable and connected to real workflows, because a policy that nobody can interpret creates accidental noncompliance. Policies also need owners and review cycles, because the environment changes and stale policies become misleading. When policies are well designed, they reduce friction by making decisions predictable. When policies are poorly designed, they increase friction by creating vague obligations and surprise enforcement. The term program is important because it suggests something ongoing, not a one-time project. A security program is the organized set of people, processes, and controls that work together to manage risk over time. It matters because security is not solved once. Systems change, threats change, and organizations change, so programs must adapt and keep learning. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking a program is a big launch, when in reality a program is a cycle of assessment, planning, execution, measurement, and improvement. Programs show up in roadmaps, regular reviews, and continuous routines like access reviews, incident exercises, and policy updates. A program also includes culture, because culture shapes whether controls are adopted or bypassed. When a program is healthy, it has rhythm and stability, and it does not depend on heroics. Understanding what a program is helps you see why consistency and sustainment are recurring themes in governance. Capability is a term that helps you focus on outcomes rather than on tools. A capability is the organization's consistent ability to achieve a security outcome, like detecting suspicious activity, controlling access, responding to incidents, or restoring services. It matters because you can own a tool and still lack the capability if the people and processes are missing. A beginner misunderstanding is confusing capability with possession, such as thinking having backups equals recovery capability. In practice, capability shows up in repeatable performance, like regularly completing restore tests successfully or consistently removing access quickly when someone leaves. Capabilities can be strong, weak, or fragile, depending on whether they work reliably and whether they depend on one person. When you assess capabilities, you identify gaps that should drive improvement priorities. Understanding capability helps you judge security maturity in a realistic way because it emphasizes what the organization can actually do during real pressure. A gap is the difference between current state and desired state, and a gap analysis is the process of identifying and describing those differences. It matters because it turns vague dissatisfaction into actionable improvement opportunities. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking a gap is simply missing a tool, when many gaps are process gaps or ownership gaps rather than technology gaps. In practice, gaps show up as measurable shortfalls, like incomplete logging on critical systems, inconsistent access reviews, or unclear escalation paths during incidents. A good gap description includes what is happening now, what should be happening, and why the difference matters to mission and risk. Gaps are valuable because they help prioritize, since not every gap has the same impact. When gaps are defined well, they support clear recommendations and roadmaps. Understanding gaps helps you see why security programs focus on targeted improvements rather than on broad statements like "we need better security." The term roadmap refers to a plan that sequences improvements over time, often in phases, so work is achievable and builds momentum. It matters because without a roadmap, security work tends to become reactive, fragmented, and driven by the latest emergency. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking a roadmap is a calendar promise, when it is better understood as a strategic sequence that accounts for dependencies and capacity. In practice, roadmaps show up as sets of initiatives with owners, milestones, and checkpoints, where early work builds foundations and later work builds maturity. Roadmaps help reduce friction by pacing change and avoiding overload. They also help communication because stakeholders can see what is coming and why. When a roadmap is used well, it becomes a steering tool that adjusts as risks and constraints change. Understanding roadmaps helps you see security as managed progress rather than as random activity. Metrics are measures used to track progress and guide decisions, and outcome-based metrics focus on results rather than on activity. They matter because you cannot improve what you cannot observe, and you cannot prove progress without evidence. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking metrics exist only for reporting, when good metrics are also for steering and pivoting. In practice, metrics show up as measures of time, reliability, recurrence, and coverage, like time to detect, restore test success rates, or reduction in repeated incidents. Metrics must be chosen carefully because they can shape behavior, and poorly chosen metrics can be gamed or can encourage superficial compliance. Good metrics are understandable, reliable, and tied to decisions, meaning a change in the metric triggers a discussion and an action. Understanding metrics helps you see how programs learn and adapt rather than staying stuck in assumptions. Metrics are the feedback loop that keeps governance grounded. The term risk acceptance describes the decision to live with a certain risk rather than reduce it immediately, often because reduction would be too costly or disruptive. It matters because organizations cannot eliminate all risk, and pretending otherwise leads to unrealistic promises. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking risk acceptance is irresponsible, when it can be a deliberate choice made with clear understanding and compensating controls. In practice, risk acceptance shows up in documented exceptions, timelines for future remediation, and leadership decisions that weigh trade-offs. Good risk acceptance requires clarity about what is being accepted, why, and for how long, because open-ended acceptance can become neglect. Risk acceptance should also be reviewed because circumstances change, and a risk that was acceptable in the past may become unacceptable later. Understanding risk acceptance helps beginners see that security decisions are often about trade-offs rather than absolute rules. It also highlights why clear documentation and review cycles matter. An exception is permission to deviate from a policy or standard for a specific reason, often with conditions that reduce risk during the exception period. It matters because real organizations face edge cases, emergencies, and constraints that policies cannot fully predict. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking exceptions are always bad, when controlled exceptions can be safer than uncontrolled workarounds. In practice, exceptions show up as requests that specify what cannot be met, why, what alternative protections will be used, and when the exception will end. Exception processes must be clear and fair, because if exceptions are too easy, policies lose meaning, and if exceptions are too hard, people bypass processes. Exceptions are also valuable learning signals because frequent exceptions can indicate that a policy is unrealistic or unclear. Understanding exceptions helps beginners see how governance balances rules with reality. It also reveals how programs maintain accountability without pretending that one-size-fits-all works perfectly. These essential terms form a foundation for rapid comprehension because they are the building blocks of how security programs are planned, communicated, executed, and improved. When you can translate words like governance, risk, control, policy, program, capability, gap, roadmap, metrics, risk acceptance, and exception into concrete meaning, you can follow the logic of security decisions without getting lost in jargon. You also become better at spotting when conversations are drifting into vagueness, because these terms force clarity about outcomes and responsibilities. The glossary is not meant to be memorized as trivia, but to become a set of mental handles you can grab when listening to real discussions. Over time, these terms will connect to each other, like roadmaps built from gaps, programs governed through reviews, and metrics guiding pivots based on risk realities. If you keep the plain language meanings in mind, you will be able to learn new concepts faster because you will have a stable vocabulary to hang them on. That is the practical purpose of this glossary, not to impress anyone, but to help you think clearly and move confidently through the rest of the material.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.